Hello, everyone. I'm going to get started. Welcome to this webinar discussion of the report we're releasing today. It's called Unlocking Advanced Nuclear Innovation, the Role of Fee Reform and Public Investment. I'm Judy Greenwald, and I'm the Executive Director of the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, a think and do tank working to realize the promise of advanced nuclear energy as a key energy and climate solution. Climate change is an existential threat, so it's essential to pursue a portfolio of promising options to give us the best chance of success. The International Energy Agency report released yesterday is just the latest careful analysis demonstrating that we need nuclear energy to meet mid-century climate targets. Advanced reactors are a promising solution that could play a major role in decarbonization, but they need more policy and investment. So I'm bringing my experience in climate and energy solutions more broadly to the advanced reactor space and informing broader climate and energy conversations with specific insights on advanced reactors. NIA identifies barriers, performs analysis, engages with stakeholders and policymakers, and nurtures entrepreneurship through its Nuclear Innovation Bootcamp. As outlined in the US strategy for advanced nuclear energy that we released jointly with the Partnership for Global Security earlier this year, licensing reform at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is an essential component of a whole of society effort required to deploy advanced nuclear energy at scale. The report we're releasing today builds on the analysis we've done over the past several years on this topic. The recommendations in this report are the logical next step in the series of innovation policies that Congress has enacted and the administration and NRC have begun to implement over the past several years. In particular, this report finds that reforming the NRC fee model to publicly fund licensing of advanced reactors would overcome an important barrier to nuclear innovation. We are honored to have Steve Burns, former commissioner and chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and current senior visiting fellow at Third Way, moderating our panel discussion today. And I now turn things over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Judy. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. And it's an interesting topic because often when we think about, and I know when I've been thinking about both pre and post NRC, I often wouldn't think naturally to come to the fee subject right away. What have we been thinking about the last few years? I know when I was still a commissioner and chairman, a lot of it is about regulatory framework. How do we adapt the LWR model to new technologies such as those Carolyn and Peter are sponsoring. But the study that NIA has done, I think is very interesting because it does touch on how the fee model can impact NRC's ability to carry out its regulatory program. Because there is a relative inflexibility with respect to funding that is otherwise provided by licensees or applicants for licenses or reviews. So I think that's what's going to be very interesting. And I'll turn it over in a minute to Alex, just to who'll give us some of the history and some of the potential areas of innovation for the fee structure. Again, this is a model when I was a little boy at the NRC in the mid 1980s. That's when really you had the growth of the fee recovery system. And I'll leave it with this thought: is just as right now we're looking at a time of innovation in nuclear energy. When you had the initial licensing and initial development of the current fleet in the 1960s into the 1970s, you basically had a very low fee structure. And so the question is, how do we model that today, or do we model that prior experience today as providing a greater incentive for innovation? I'm going to stop there. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. First is Alex Gilbert, who's project manager with Nuclear Innovation Alliance. He's done an excellent job on this report, and he's going to lead us through a lot of it. Then Carolyn Cochran, who's a co-founder and the chief operating officer of Oklo, will give her thoughts. And finally, Peter Hastings, who's the vice president of regulatory affairs and quality at Kairos Power, will share some perspectives. So take it away, Alex.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks as well for moderating this. So we really appreciate that. So I'm just going to share a very brief PowerPoint that kind of highlights the high-level conclusions from our report and kind of our process to get there. I do recommend checking out the report. At the very least, there's a lot of interesting history here about how we developed the fee model, and we do identify a lot of the concerns we have moving forward. One thing that I would emphasize at the offset of this webinar, when we're looking at this model, this is part of a much larger picture of regulatory modernization at the NRC. This is really something that there's a lot of other things that if you were to change this part of how NRC works, you'd have to change other parts as well. That would be things that are changing in the overall organizational structure and management at NRC. And so we think this is a piece of the puzzle, but it is a discrete piece of the puzzle. So this is something that we think can definitely start continuing to change the regulatory structure at NRC and potentially move a relatively large barrier to both regulatory activities, to making sure they're efficient, but also to companies and innovation. So the conversation that we're having here really was started with the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, NEMA, several years ago, and we see this discussion as the next step. So just for context, one thing that we think is really important to understand here is that we're at an inflection point with the nuclear industry in the United States, as well as nuclear regulation. And so when we're looking at the potential for new technologies, we're really moving away from the large conventional light water reactors that dominated our initial 40, 50 years of the nuclear industry in the United States. We're looking at advanced reactor technologies. We're looking at new advanced light water technologies, other non-light water technologies, and we have a regulatory framework that we're currently in the process of transforming to adapt to these new technologies. The buzzword is usually that we have a prescriptive-based system, which means that we've written the requirements into the regulations. We're going to a performance-based system, where what we want to do is say, hey, no matter how your reactor is designed, we want you to meet these requirements for safety. And if you can do that, then that's something that if you can prove that you've done that, that could potentially be a much easier way to get regulated, but it also is just generally a more effective regulatory method with our current 21st century models. Additionally, as we're looking at the change and the shift from these large conventional reactors, we actually have a lot of other options ranging from things like microreactors to mid-sized reactors, small modular reactors. And that means we have new customer classes for the first time. We have new companies involved. Historically, one of the big issues we had is that there were only a handful of nuclear reactor developers. There were often large multinational corporations. And so for them, a fee system might not have been as much of a financial barrier. But when we're looking at the industry that we're trying to develop, we're trying to look towards a very vibrant, very competitive future. And so we need to think about how our regulatory system is impacting new entrants. So what is the fee model? I'll talk a little bit about the numbers in terms of requirements, but it's basically composed of two elements. There are 10 CFR Part 170 fees. These are hourly fees that are charged to specific applicants when they're getting a specific item or regulatory engagement of value. So the easiest way to think about that, and the thing that we focused on, is if you're trying to get a license at the NRC to build and operate a nuclear facility, that's something that there is a discrete value and you're charged hourly fees. And those hourly fees are actually just under $300 per hour. So that can add up pretty quickly. We also do have hourly fees for existing reactors and other people that do engagements with the NRC. But what we were specifically looking at were those new license applications. We also have 10 CFR Part 171 annual fees, and this is actually where the majority of the NRC's budget is coming from, where the majority of the fees occur. And those are annual fees on existing licensees. Now, we didn't look at as much at that as we did as the Part 170 fees. But they do have relationships, and it is important to kind of think when we're looking specifically at the Part 170 fees in terms of really trying to incentivize innovation, how does that play out in the overall model? So the fee model, as Commissioner Burns hinted, really kind of took off in the 1980s. There were minor fees beforehand, and we see fees as early as the time of the Atomic Energy Commission. But during the 1980s, they actually, as part of a general government implementation of user fees across federal agencies, we saw a requirement put into the budget that the NRC get a certain amount of its overall budget recovered from fees. And those were a mix of both those Part 170 and Part 171 fees. That actually increased really rapidly. You can see in this graph here between about fiscal year 1987 and 1990, and went from not having a requirement to having 100% of the budget be recovered through fees. And particularly in the 1990s, there were a lot of concerns there that some of the things that were being charged to the industry were not necessarily things that made sense. Like a good example are NRC's international activities. When they're doing work overseas with other nuclear regulators, doesn't really make sense for our existing licensees to pay that. They're not exactly getting a benefit from that. And so in response to those and some other related concerns, we saw that that number, that 100%, got reduced down to 90% of the budget had to be recovered from fees starting in 2005. And that was, at the time, was part of the Energy Policy Act of 2005 that was made permanent moving forward. And that actually creates some weird incentives. And we're actually still dealing with those incentives now, that essentially, if the NRC wanted to spend $1 million for things that did not directly impact existing licensees or current applications, they actually had to increase the amount of fees they charge that existing group by $9 million. So that was a really big challenge where we're looking specifically at advanced reactors. If you wanted to fund a rulemaking to create new rules for advanced reactors, at the time we're just really starting to take off and really begin the design process, you would have had to increase fees pretty significantly on the existing fleet. And that creates kind of a weird structural incentive. The existing fleet doesn't necessarily want to see innovation if they're paying for it, and it's not something that's benefiting them. And so that did lead to a fair amount of issues in terms of how we develop the regulatory framework that we have now. And this was one of the primary reasons that we had the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act. And now NEMA did a lot of things, and it really kind of kickstarted regulatory modernization from a legislative perspective. But most importantly, what it did is it changed it from having this, you have to have 90% of the budget, no matter what the budget is, recovered from fees, to actually more explicitly defining things as being part of a fee base and things being off fee. Now, we had off fee things before, and that's things like those international activities. But really what this meant is that instead of requiring, no matter what, 90% of the budget's recovered by fees, we actually would then add up individually, here are the fee activities, here are the off fee activities, and making sure that we actually didn't have that structural incentive anymore. And so that makes a lot of sense. And that's kind of the starting point for our analysis. What we really started at was looking at the basic economic motivation for doing user fees. And so the way I really describe this is that we implement user fees when there's a government function that has benefits for a private entity. And so the best way to think about that is something like a national park. If you go and visit a national park, you're going to pay a fee to go enter the park and to use the facilities there, because you as a private individual are getting most of those benefits. Now, the problem is when we go to something like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, when you get to a regulatory context, regulation is a public good. It's something that benefits everybody. So yes, an applicant does benefit from being able to have their license, be able to operate their facility. But there are also significant benefits from being able to use nuclear power. The carbon emissions reductions that we see, the reduced air pollution, the economic benefits, the national security benefits, from a public perspective, just having the reassurance that there's an independent regulator. And so when we kind of started looking at the system, we thought that we should reevaluate this from a framework of who is benefiting from nuclear regulation and how are we allocating those benefits. So moving to specifically advanced reactor reviews, we see kind of two major issues when we are applying this fee system, and particularly these hourly fees to advanced reactors. The first, and the thing that Commissioner Burns was hinting at, which I think is potentially very problematic, is the efficiency of reviews. Now, there's a very large macro picture here that's important in terms of what's happening at the NRC. The NRC overall is shrinking as an agency just because we do see that decrease in the overall existing fleet. But when we're talking about advanced reactor reviews, we're actually kind of in a different position where we need to probably be growing this stuff slowly over time. It's a small portion of the overall budget. And so what we're concerned about with the kind of efficiency question is getting the right resources to the right project at the right time. Because when NRC makes these internal decisions, they have to constantly be considering hourly fees. That can create weird internal management structures on a micro level at a project level. And so that's something that we think if you were to move away from this model, you could actually potentially have a fair bit more regulatory efficiency. Second, and the one that the other panelists I think will really be able to kind of talk to a lot more, is that just like any time that you put a cost on something like a carbon tax, you discourage it. In the case of these hourly fees, you're essentially charging for innovation. And so if we're trying to build a new generation of safer, more economic reactors that can really help restore American competitiveness, we're kind of creating a regulatory barrier right now to that innovation. So we looked comparably at other agencies, and there are a few things that really stuck out to us. First, we looked at the Federal Aviation Administration and the Food and Drug Administration. Now, these are really interesting regulatory agencies because they're very similar to the NRC in that they're regulating innovative activities. And in the case of the FAA, even though most of the agency is funded by user fees, those user fees are exclusively on economic activities. It's ticket sales. They're not charging fees for their review of what's called a type certification, which is similar to what the NRC does for a reactor license. So you're not having that disincentive to innovation. The Food and Drug Administration is a little bit different. They've had to actually substantially grow their overall budget over time. And implementing user fees there was really effective when combined with public investment by being able to balance both public and private interests in the funding of the agency. And that's one of the reasons, among several others, that FAA is considered to have a relatively efficient and effective regulatory review system. Another agency that we did want to flag specifically is the Environmental Protection Agency. So this is the agency that most closely regulates the safety of a lot of nuclear energy's competitors, particularly fossil fuels and other entities that cause air pollution. And there are very small permit fees for those type of entities done by EPA and the state agencies, but they're really minor compared to nuclear license fees. And so the way that this fee system has worked out across the federal agency is actually disincentivizing the nuclear industry and kind of raising a roadblock that our competitors are not facing. We also looked internationally, and our closest nuclear collaborators, the United Kingdom and Canada, also have fee systems. Canada is a little bit lower at 70% of recovery. The United Kingdom's at 100% recovery. But the thing that's really interesting and important about these countries is they have performance-based licensing. So their systems are generally perceived to be much more efficient and easier to go through with a non-light water reactor. And so the fees are part of the calculation that companies are making, that when you have that efficient system, you don't have to pay for inefficient things like figuring out an exemption because you don't have a regulatory requirement that actually applies to your advanced reactor. One thing that we thought was really interesting looking internationally, though, is that both China and Russia do not have user fees. And that is because they have completely different innovation and government models for nuclear industry. They have state-owned enterprises, and that's something that if we want to be competitive on the global market, we'll be competing with those state-owned enterprises. And we're kind of putting a barrier in the face of our competitive advantage, which is innovation. By having these regulatory fees, we're hobbling ourselves compared to those competitors that, yes, they don't have the same model, but they also just don't have these fees. So we have high-level recommendations. These are a lot more detailed in the report, but generally speaking, we think that it's really important to increase the overall public investment in advanced reactor regulation. There is some funding that is off fee from NEMA that we think has been really important, and we think that should continue. But we think that there might be a case to expand that relatively significantly. We also think when it comes specifically to licensing that we should either significantly reform or completely replace the fee model for license applications. There are a number of different ways that you can do this. There are a number of elements, particularly things like pre-application or environmental reviews that we think are justified on the basis of user benefits and also just encouraging innovation. Alternatively, we don't replace that from the NRC side. There are a number of options to provide funding from the Department of Energy, things like licensing prizes, or there is a previously authorized program that could be appropriated funding that would allow you to do some sort of cost share recovery. And so between these options, we think there's a number of things that Congress should consider. We also have some minor recommendations. The NRC is somewhat constrained with what they can do, but we think there might be some room in existing authorities. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the presentation there and give it back to Commissioner Burns.
Okay, thanks, Alex. And next we'll hear from Carolyn Cochran.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Burns, and thank you to NIA for doing this important work on fees. We really appreciate that they have. Oklo has been speaking about fees and the need to change it for some years now. Oklo actually was the first in the recent spate of advanced reactors to begin paid interactions with the NRC actually in 2016. So it's amazing to look back and, that was 5 years ago. And from, the lowest rate that we've paid to the rate that's being proposed for 2021 for hourly fees, it's gone up 10%. So I think even in this span of time, we're seeing swings that are substantive. Over the years, we've been able to work with the NRC staff, I think quite successfully, to manage fees and to understand what our bills would be through different planning documents and so forth. And we really appreciate that. But we've also seen how even the fee structure actually hamstrings the NRC staff themselves. So just to share with that, I know it's in the NIA report, but just to share kind of our personal experience, by having, the need to recoup fees, but also to budget years in advance, developers like us, as well as the staff working with them, are kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, right? Not only do we have to pay for all of it, but it has to be budgeted years in advance and approved by Congress and the whole thing. So I think that that's fundamentally a backwards system, whether it was 90% or 100%. It's just a challenging system, and it's something that affects all of us that are doing any hourly work, or once we get annual fees and pay an annual licensing fee. Not only did hourly fees go up, but for operating plants, their annual fees went up by almost about $500,000 for 2021. So we're definitely seeing fees go, I believe, in the wrong direction if we want to encourage innovation in this space. Like Alex brought up, we also don't think that each plant closure should increase the burden so much on the plants that are left. And you can see how, different amounts of activities, whether hourly activities and different amounts of plants that are open or not open, can dramatically affect the remainder. And so we're all coupled together in a way that's a bit artificial. And I think revisiting how this whole system works would be really important. We've been told that it couldn't be done, it couldn't be changed, but NEMA certainly changed a substantive amount of that. And I think it could be looked at again and ambitiously changed to incentivize innovation and to help small entities. Regulatory costs are a significant barrier to entry, especially for small entities. And I think there's federal rules about looking at small business fees that we've been interested in and looking at. And I guess I would suggest too that, just even, Oklo over the years, like last year, we probably spent about $1 million just in fees to the NRC. So, might be surprised that it affects even small entities rather sizably as in terms of our overall budget and costs. Oklo in particular is privately funded, and we're not utilizing any government funds to pay those fees. And I'm not suggesting that government funds are needed. I think that the overall fee structure should be modified, and I think we've been talking about that, and NIA is proposing that to look more like other agencies and also to be more in line. We actually believe that could also improve the working relationship between applicants and the NRC, but also improve the public's perception of the NRC's independence from the industry. If the industry is not paying 100% of their budget, there could create a little more separation there that I think would be quite beneficial. So once again, I just really appreciate NIA looking at this topic. I'll keep my comments relatively short, but appreciate and looking forward to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. And next we'll hear from Peter Hastings from Kairos.
Thank you, Commissioner Burns, and thanks to NIA for their work on this and the opportunity to participate. Let me apologize up front in the event I get momentarily sidelined by a nagging cough I've developed. I want to echo Caroline's remarks and provide a little background on Kairos to put some context around my remarks. We're a mission-driven company, and that mission, which is to enable the world's transition to clean energy with the ultimate goal of dramatically improving people's quality of life while protecting the environment, will only be possible if we think about nuclear differently and prioritize our efforts to produce a technology that's not only safe, but also affordable. We recently celebrated our 4th anniversary, so we haven't been around very long. We emerged from a DOE-sponsored integrated research project, and our co-founders, who all participated in that project, concluded that the next logical step was to establish a private company to commercialize the fluoride salt-cooled high-temperature reactor. Like Oklo, we're privately funded, we're singularly focused, and we're fully committed to design, license, and demonstrate our technology through iterative development and demonstration programs. Our schedule is to deploy a commercial reactor before 2030, with a significant ramp up in deployment shortly thereafter. We've made substantial progress even in the last year through the pandemic. We've commissioned or are in the process of developing several different test facilities. We made the decision formally to include, in addition to our commercial plant, a low power demonstration reactor as part of our development strategy, and very quickly moved to acquire a site on our nickel on the East Tennessee Technology Park for deployment of that reactor, which we call Hermes. And we recently won an advanced reactor demonstration project risk reduction award and are in the process of negotiating that contract. We've also been very active in pre-application engagement for the past 2.5 years, which is important in terms of today's meeting. Pre-application engagement refers to conferring with the NRC staff on various aspects of our design well in advance of submitting a formal application. Pre-application engagement is entirely optional, but has been touted over the past several years as one of the best ways to establish an efficient review of the application itself. Apart from the obvious benefits of familiarizing the NRC with a design, we're also taking maximum advantage to front load our engagement with early review of substantive topical reports. We've submitted over 20 technical or topical reports or revisions to those reports. We've piloted what the NRC advertises as a no RAI approach to addressing NRC's questions. We've helped develop and pilot licensing modernization efforts to conform the regulatory framework to a more efficient and risk-informed approach. And we have several draft and final NRC safety evaluations on several topical reports, including reviews by the Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards. So I say all that to point out that this level of engagement, we believe, will pay dividends in a more efficient review of the application itself. It marks us as a serious and committed applicant, and that's all great. In the process, we've spent on the order of $2 million in NRC fees. We are fully committed, and we have stable private funding in the near term with very good prospects for future funding. We're very active in pre-application engagement and iterative development of our own test platforms, with a clear motivation to innovate and reduce programmatic risk in furtherance of our mission to enable the world's transition to clean energy. But if we weren't well funded, but still had the kinds of innovations that we bring to bear, the pace of pre-application engagement, which we think will result in efficient licensing, and the cost of that engagement could clearly constitute a significant barrier to entry. As I said, we're $2 million down the road with NRC fees, and the formal application review hasn't started. And that will generate plenty of additional NRC invoices in the future. And it's important to note, this is for a demonstration platform that will not generate $1 of revenue. Moving pre-application and application review expenses off fee in some way could stimulate innovation. Clearly, it would make sense to balance that approach with some protection to ensure the NRC isn't inundated with frivolous applications or with engagements that are intended primarily to act as a marketing tool. And it's essential that moving these costs off fee not adversely impact the operating fleet. But removing the barrier to entry could be a useful way to encourage advances in technology. So I'll stop there. I'm pleased to be able to participate in this important discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you all to our panelists for their insights and for helping to kick off this discussion. I mean, it's just, we're starting to get a few questions in on the chat, which I sort of noted and we'll get to. But one of the things, perhaps just to kick this off, given Alex's review of the report, and particularly with respect to the funding models that are used by some other agencies, I'd just like to get any reactions, if you have either Caroline or Peter or Alex, any reactions to the model used by, say, the FAA or by the FDA in terms of how to structure it. As I understand, for example, in the FDA model, you are helping in terms of new drug applicants by not necessarily requiring all up front some sort of fee. It's either deferred or it's a partial fee of thing, something like that. But let me leave it at that and see if there are any reactions to what kind of model you think might be pragmatic or practical. Anybody?
So I guess I'll start. I don't have a strong opinion on the specifics of the model. I think anything that can help levelize the playing field will help. We're up against headwinds with competition of technologies that with actual, no kidding, measurable public health impacts every day that don't face anywhere near the regulatory burden that and the associated costs that nuclear does. And I do think that looking at other regulatory models that seem to make more sense is a good start. I think working out the specifics of the details between an FAA model versus an FDA model versus other examples. I hope we get to have that conversation, right? I hope this report gets enough traction that will encourage that kind of detailed discussion around what the specific model should look like.
Okay. Caroline, anything you want to add?
Thank you. Yes, I think like Peter, just having the discussion is an important start. I think when we've envisioned it, it's mostly towards just the government funding the regulator more. So the cost share relatively simply being changed to closer to 50-50 or something on that order of magnitude. I think like Peter brought up earlier, you certainly can't lower fees to the point where people are submitting things for PR points or in a disingenuous way, or floods their work with a lot of potentially frivolous work. I think you should have skin in the game. We've certainly always believed that and tried to show that at Oklo. And like I said before, I do believe that the staff have really worked with us on making sure that the fees that were assessed were expected. But they and us have to work within this existing system. And I realize one thing that I kind of didn't talk about as much is also the time lag that's associated with that. So certainly federal budgeting takes years. So they're budgeting now for 2 years from now. And it was certainly the case when we started, working with them, getting to know how much different things would cost, if our estimates were lining up with their estimates, and kind of just getting to know working with each other. I would say that could have taken a couple of years. And then if by that point you're ready to estimate when you're going to submit an application, that would have to be essentially 2 years in the future. I think that could also affect applicants that are just starting to engage now, but expect to engage in a serious way and they may hope to do it in less than 2 years, but their budgeting cycle is in that way. Certainly Oklo and Kairos and some others that started years ago have kind of put their stake in the ground, and there's kind of an order of operations there as far as that. But I do think that time lag could also, and on top of the costs, really present barriers to entry and to movement forward that neither the NRC nor applicants truly want. And I think it's just part of the game, but I do think that just starting with the government funding more of a portion of the regulator would be sizable. And I don't think it's people maybe don't realize the total NRC budget is not absolutely immense. It's roughly $1 billion a year. I haven't looked at it for this year, exact numbers, but numbers significantly higher than that are being bandied about to promote advanced nuclear or to support existing nuclear. And at one fell swoop, we could take away one of the biggest annual costs or ongoing costs for any company. Not that I'm saying that we should make it 100% paid for by the government, but it's just the order of magnitude, and thinking that way, I think, is an important way to think about how this issue could be solved. And it would it would literally benefit everyone roughly equally. And I think it's rare that you find a topic where you could address it and it wouldn't be disproportionately beneficial to one group versus another. It would be uniformly beneficial, I believe, if the government funded the regulator more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, a few just quick points, because I think all those are really excellent. On Caroline's point just there, we didn't do as much of this for the report, but we kind of estimate that right around now it's anywhere between $10 to $15 million in fees are being charged to companies right now that are in the licensing process. So that's not a ton of money. And if we do actually look at the applications we expect that's happening the rest of this decade, we're talking tens of millions of dollars, not hundreds of millions of dollars. And because of the timing specifically of the fees, because it's so early in project and development life cycles, you can actually have an outsized impact. So it's kind of potentially a win-win-win in terms of innovation, regulatory efficiency, and bang for your buck. And in terms of the comparison to the other agencies, there's two things I think are really worth noting. One, the FAA was really effective at regulating drones, in part because they were efficient as a regulator, because they were not bound by any sort of fee considerations when they're assigning staff or when they're doing other sorts of resource activities. So that was something that I thought was really interesting when we were looking at that case study. And then the way that the fees are currently working, one of the things to understand is that we have a system that we're adapting for advanced reactors. That imposes a lot of cost, especially on first movers. And some of those costs are not necessarily justified. So when each time an applicant comes through, they'll deal with exemptions or non-applicabilities or other things that are unique to their reactor design. But that builds a basis for future advanced reactor developers to be able to use that licensing experience. And so that's great, and that's really awesome that that's happening. But from a first mover perspective, that actually kind of creates disincentives. You don't necessarily, it doesn't make sense to pay for your competitor to have an easier review later on. And so there's kind of this cross-subsidization going on that we think if we could figure out some sort of way to change that, you can make it so that overall you're removing those disincentives, and you're also not penalizing the current advanced reactor developers in the United States for not necessarily having as rapid of a system or as efficient of a system as we see in other countries.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I was just going to comment on a couple of reactions to what I've heard. One, I will joke, when I was on the commission, I always had to ask what year was it, because particularly when you go into budgeting space, because you're either in the current fiscal year or you're planning out for the next one, or you might be going to a hearing on next year's budget, and then you're about to start the planning for 2 years from then. And I know, I mean, God bless the staff, but you've got, there's always this kind of outreach they have to do to potential applicants. We've heard you might be interested. When do you think that's going to be? And it's not that that's, a useless exercise. I think it is important in terms of how to schedule the agency's work, but it does become a challenge, I think, as Carolyn was saying, with regard to, you got to do the guessing game and do a little, bit of backwards and forwards to try to get there. And, what's the value? The second thing that she noted, and this is one that's very interesting, I get a lot in some of my foreign interactions. It's the question on how can you be charging fees and call yourself an independent regulator? I lecture on international nuclear law with the NEA and the IAEA, and that is a question every time I present, the basics of regulation I talk about, then I mention fees, I get that question. We recognize that in the system we have, the NRC is still required to depend on appropriations, and the fees go into the general treasury, but there still is this kind of perception with respect to the recovery of fees, or particularly at the 90%, or when it was one time 100% level. A couple other, getting some questions coming in, and I think I think we've got some interesting ones because they focus on this question of, well, if you don't charge the fees, who's paying for it? So I've got one question here is, how does government funding or public investment into NRC fees, what does that look like? A tax on electricity, something else? I'll throw out is what it used to be is basically it's appropriations. It's not, it's, from the Congress, from the US Treasury. It's not then a supplementary, tax here or there. Alex has described models like, every time we get on an airplane, in effect, we are paying into that system, us as individual passengers. But let me pose that question again to our panelists. Is there some nature of a public, would public investment in NRC fees look like?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And so one thing that's important to understand about how this system works is that Congress appropriates the funding for NRC. And so what actually would happen is that appropriation in and of itself would probably not change significantly. Rather, what would happen is that instead of getting that appropriation matched to a cost recovery, you would not match it to a cost recovery. And so this would come from the general treasury. In that sense, it would ultimately come from the taxpayer, just like we pay for the Environmental Protection Agency or many other types of safety regulators out there. And I definitely can understand that, yes, you could be seeing an impact on taxpayers, but when we look at this type of innovation activity, what we generally see is that these are activities with high economic multipliers. So the degree that we can encourage them, we actually will create economic activity that would pay for those tax incomes themselves over time. And so that's something that I think there's kind of a net balance in terms of the public treasury accounting in the long term.
Okay. Anyone else want to add? Another question we received was, how does government funding of a vendor for fees benefit the public? The product is in effect a document or a certification or a design, not particularly the energy. So I think they're looking at this is that's one step away. So how is that, if we look at this issue that Alex brought up about public benefit, how does that, how do you answer that or look at that?
I'll take a stab at that one. I think in precisely the same way the EPA provides benefit. It's true that the NRC doesn't produce anything other than documents, but those documents are an absolute prerequisite to deploying the technology. So if you don't get those documents, you can't deploy the technology. And so the public benefit of a no carbon baseload technology won't exist without the licensing action. So I think there's a clear benefit. The fact that it's one step removed is sort of academic.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I wanted to give an interesting example. We have some friends working on a supersonic plane, and it's just amazing to me that they can literally get a license for a prototype plane for significantly cheaper, that can fly actual people and have significant safety hazards much more quickly and much cheaper than existing, getting a prototype for a plant that's maybe out in the middle of nowhere and incredibly small. So I think that's just one other kind of benchmark of another agency that provides, yes, a piece of paper, but a really important one. So I think there's many models to look at, and I think the NRC provides a service to the public. That being said, if the public were to decide that the service that the NRC provides is not of public interest, I think that of itself would be quite interesting. But I think the assumption is they provide a public benefit and that it's worthwhile paying for.
Okay, thanks. One other viewpoint is we've talked about, and Alex certainly touched on the difference between the Part 170 and Part 171 fees. In other words, the fees that both you, Peter, and Carolyn are experiencing because you're interested in applications for a new technology versus the annual fee that winds up being assessed primarily against operating reactors in the U.S. So the question is that how do annual fees versus the hourly fee for the new technologies or licensing reviews discourage innovation? They're not, because the assumption here is because they're not paid until a facility is built and licensed.
Yeah, I'd love to start on that real quick. Because when you're a company and you're presenting to investors, you have to think about the life cycle costs of the plant, especially in our case with the business model of owning and operating. Even if you're selling to utility, that's something you have to really consider. And the way the fees are structured, certainly now, and they're being looked at being changed, but microreactors simply couldn't be economical without some changes, and they're working on that right now. But I think even the levels of fees are very important to how what markets are suddenly opened up for these smaller, simpler, safer plants with these different modern benefits. I think, if you have a fee structure that's set up to effectively rule out a technology for an area, that certainly hinders innovation, but it also hinders access for people in those areas to different products that would otherwise exist. So it can very fundamentally affect what products come to market and what people actually have access to or for their community.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the focus of the report is on the hourly fees, first of all, but the annual fee structure, as Caroline said, we continue to look at it, make suggestions. The NRC staff are reasonably receptive to the feedback. Fundamentally, the annual fees should be a function of the expected amount of NRC oversight on the plant. And if it's got a significantly reduced risk profile, much smaller, lower or no security force, those kinds of things, then the annual fee for that reactor ought to be smaller than for a large light water reactor that has a large NRC resident staff, for example.
So we focused in the report primarily on hourly fees. There's definitely interactions, but one thing I thought was really interesting was an anecdote that we found from the 1990s when the fee model went to 100%. And it was focused on hourly fees, but it was an existing licensee who was considering submitting a TOPCO report. Now, TOPCO reports are really useful technical documents. They basically convey a number of different technical aspects to regulators. It allows you to build upon regulatory cases and decide to do new things that will generally make nuclear safer. And the commenter was saying that his company, an existing licensee that pays the annual fees normally, did not want to pay additional hourly fees for a TOPCO report they were thinking about. And so they did not do that TOPCO report. And so because there was that actual disincentive for potentially innovation and an hourly fee level for an existing licensee, that raises questions about just, does that system actually incentivize safety if industry finds something they think can make things safer, but then they have to go through this whole process and pay for it, as opposed to trying to just operationalize it and work with the NRC to make sure that we're doing the best system possible.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. One other, I'll add an anecdote I heard at one time, is that with respect to the annual fees, again, you're looking at that 90% recovery overall, and I forget how much of that in terms of the part for individual applications, how much that comes to, but it's fairly high given the statistics Alex gave. But one of the thing is, if you've got a company that is sort of lukewarm on where it's going in terms of its generation, et cetera, it's not like everybody's in this together, that all who are in effect licensed by the NRC or paying are necessarily interested in having some of their fees pay for, in effect, newer technologies which they may not engage in or things like that. So it's not as if the group that is in the fee base is necessarily all of one mind in terms of where things are going with the technology. So I think that's also kind of interesting. Peter, we had a question for you, which was, if you don't charge the fees, how do you screen out and affect those publicity seekers or those who really aren't very serious about the new projects?
Yeah, I saw that question come up, and it's a great question, and that is an important filter to apply. I do think that sort of, I hesitate to use the term acceptance review because it's got all kinds of baggage associated with it, but a sort of a pre-screening evaluation of what's going to come in would be relatively straightforward. It also could put the staff in a difficult position of having to draw a judgment on the viability of something in advance of having looked at it in any substantive way. but to Caroline's remarks that followed on this subject, I think some amount of fee could be an effective barrier to that kind of frivolity. She used the term skin in the game, and that certainly makes sense, to not necessarily reduce the hourly fee to nothing, but perhaps put in some sort of cost share that would reduce the overall cost, but still require the applicant to demonstrate that they're serious, even if it's only through a financial obligation.
Okay. Thanks. I would agree that the screening process and the staff is going to do is that's probably the most important thing coming out of it.
And one thing on that, when we were doing this report, this is something that we actually saw come up quite a lot. And one thing that I think is really important to emphasize about this report is we kind of really see this as the start of a conversation. And this is one of those issues that you would really need to think about and figure out the implementation. There's ways that you could do this. You could do this with some sort of deposit. You could do this with a flat application fee. But one thing that we think would be really useful is looking at how other agencies deal with this, because a lot of other agencies do have to deal with all sorts of applications, patent office, the FDA. So there are ways that you do these type of things in a way that's fair to applicants, but also respects agency resources and time.
Okay, thanks. Alex, I think we got a question here for you, if I can find it again. So, well, let me go to another. I'm trying to read this in the chat, but one of the questions someone posed is, how much does it cost in sort of a ballpark range of fees to get a new nuclear plant licensed? Now I think NuScale, Alex, I'm going to leave it to you, because I think NuScale was around 70 million. That's basically for a design certification, but go ahead, and if there's details you can provide.
Yeah, that was one of the things that we thought was really hard to think about looking at this, because NuScale is the one example we have in an advanced reactor that got a certification. It's a design certification, so it's not actually authorization to build and operate a facility. And so that 70 million is really high. And there are a number of things that they were doing that subsequent applications can learn from, but it's really hard to be able to judge anything from that. And so really it's going to depend on how much review is necessary and the specific reactor type that you have, as well as just how things develop. And it very well could be a situation that because another applicant addresses something, the subsequent applications are going to be less expensive. But it's really hard to say. It's definitely a relatively high financial barrier, though, especially I think for a lot of the first movers.
Okay.
I'll add that I think NuScale's cost, and I've heard the same number, between 70 and 80 million, does not include pretty substantive pre-application fees that they paid as well, on the order of 10 or 15 million dollars. In a past life, I did a combined license application, and the total cost for that in NRC fees was tens of millions of dollars. It was, I think, around 40 or 50 million. So it's not a small number.
Okay. One question we have is that with respect to the example, Alex, you found from the 1990s on this topical report, the question is, did the failure to submit that topical report for approval derail any new reactor projects?
So that one specifically, I believe, was an operational improvement on an existing facility. But I think that the issue here is that when you're looking at potentially the overall licensing process, the timeliness of these things and when they can happen in the process and how you incentivize them, it's not some matter much of like one specific thing will make or break a license application. It's more of how long does it take? How much does that end up costing? How much uncertainty does that create? How does that have knock-on impacts on investors and other things? And also one thing that's really important about topical reports is that you can usually use topical reports that someone else has submitted. And so these are the type of things that they really improve the overall regulatory efficiency. So maybe a company wants to submit a topical report, but they decide this is not going to cost us a lot of money, or this is going to cost us a fair amount of money. We're not going to get a lot of benefit from it. maybe they won't submit that, even though 3 or 4 or 5 subsequent applicants would have been able to benefit from that. And those are things that you can't necessarily point to any clear examples right now. We're still pretty early in the overall process. But when we look at the timing that we're talking about, we want to really make sure that we don't create regulatory barriers. And that's something that can potentially slow not just an individual licensee's pathway, but it could slow a whole group of applicants.
Okay, thanks. We've got time for a couple more questions before we wrap up at 1 o'clock. One commenter said that yes, controlling fees is important, but I get frustrated sometimes by the number of NRC staff that attend a meeting. How do you deal with that? I don't want to put Carol or Peter on the spot on this since you're in the process of reviews, but is that, you see that as a potential issue? And what do you think about that, any of you?
Yeah, so that's something that we heard a number of different opinions on. And one thing I think that if we don't change the fee system itself, this is where we can do some other sorts of things. And so we do have a pot of money that we're using for advanced reactor regulatory infrastructure. A lot of times when you have those type of situations, there's justifications for using some of that money within a license review, because maybe you have staff that you want to get more familiar. You know, they're going to have more applications in the future. And so it might make sense for that staff member to attend a meeting, even though they would only have a minor impact of the overall project. So there could be internal NRC justification to use a different pot of money for that. And there are a number of things management-wise like that we think are worth exploring and figuring out if we could do that.
Okay. And I've got 2 last questions I'll pose here. First, is there any consideration by Department of Energy or funding its clean energy regulatory work with a form of carbon penalty fee on the emitting sectors? This arrangement, the commenter says, this arrangement could be helpful. I'd
be interested to speak to that, but I also wanted, if it's okay, to speak to the prior question. I will say that is an area that the NRC has been responsive, at least in our experience, as far as, you know, who attends what meeting. And I think it required a new kind of diligence that was relatively new, or at least we heard that from them, that, you know, really thinking about who really needs to be in a meeting or not, or whether they bill to us or whether they bill to a general kind of training fund, was I think useful in a place where we, you know, our regular kind of, we had a quarterly licensing project plan that we worked towards, and how many people we expect to be involved, and just having a core team that was assigned to us. I think we kind of knew, okay, here's the core team that are assigned to us, and here's even the subsets of that team that focus on fuel or accidents and so forth. So I will say that I feel like number of staff has actually been an area where we've really seen good progress there, and obviously we'd like to see it continue both for us and for others. I will say where it actually can get challenging is ACRS joining meetings, I think both for the staff and for the applicant. So while they don't bill themselves, they can distract meetings where there might be 30 people on the line billing hourly. And they may also call meetings to which all of our core team may attend, and they set the schedule and so forth. So I think that could be an area that could be improved when it comes to fees. And I know that's a little off topic to this. I think it could be interesting, different funding structures as far as how do you really, you know, the NRC oversees our the United States' largest clean energy provider, right? Like nuclear power. And how can we make sure that mission holds through and in the course of their serving public safety, but also make sure that there's not disproportionate burden on, you know, our cleanest energy versus not clean energy, which maybe doesn't have to deal with quite so many hoops, and may actually emit more radioactivity to the environment than nuclear even does. So I think that's an interesting question, although it's difficult for me to comment on that last question that you brought up.
And we've basically run out of time, but I do want to note a comment that former NRC Commissioner Jeff Merrifield offered. He says it would be his thinking that if the agency, the NRC, had to be responsible for the cost of its review and justify it to Congress, it might inject more discipline in the process, as I'll have to be accountable to Congress rather than just having costs pass on to licensees. And I think that's an interesting thought. In terms of the process. I'm sorry we've run out of time, but I do want to thank our panelists, Alex Gilbert, Peter Hastings, and Carolyn Cochran for their contributions and thoughts today. As I say, I think I urge people to read the study. It's really I think it's an interesting read for us folk who like the nuclear stuff. But it's an important topic, and it really is a way of thinking about innovation in terms of the regulatory system and moving forward. So thanks again on behalf of Nuclear Innovation Alliance.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.